Okay, welcome to our Parsha discussion. This is a mitzvah of the week, the weekly mitzvah, because I thought this one was really beautiful. This week we are moving on finally to Parsha Beha'alotcha. And let me share my screen. Rav Tabori asks a really interesting question. Maybe before I share my screen, I'll just say Rav Tabori asks a really interesting question that I think a lot of us probably take for granted, which is he asks, is there any obligation, is there any mitzvah to have Simcha, particularly on Shabbat? Welcome back, Bobby. We were just getting started. I was saying that before we look at the sources, I think Rav Tabori asks just fundamentally a very interesting question, which is there a mitzvah to have Simcha on Shabbat? And I think, as we'll see, there's Yom Tov and there's Shabbat, and there are sort of different names for the things that we're meant to experience on those times. But it's something that I hadn't thought about carefully before this. So let me share my screen here. Okay. So before we look at this week's parsha, we're just going to remind ourselves of the mitzvot as they stand thus far. So the mitzvah of Shabbat is found in two places, right? The two sets of Aseret HaDibrot. So in Shmot, which we just read on Shavuot, right? Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. Remember Shabbat and keep it holy. And then in Devarim, when Moshe is recapping, the Ten Commandments are repeated. And here it says, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho ka'asher tzivcha et Hashem Elokecha. Observe Shabbat and keep it holy as Hashem has commanded you. And based on these two different psukim, the Rambam says, Arba'at Dvarim ne'amru b'Shabbat, that there are actually four dimensions to the way that we celebrate Shabbat. Shnayim min haTorah, those are the two we just saw, right? Ushnayim mi divrei sofrim, and two of them are found in the oral law. V'hem mefarshin al yedei hanavim, and there are explained by the prophets. Shabbat Torah, Zachor Ushamor, right? He refers to both of those psukim. V'shenit parshu al yedei nevi'im kavod va'oneg. Shene'amar Yishayahu v'karata l'Shabbat oneg v'likdosh Hashem mechubad. So, right, we have four words that are important to the Rambam. Zachor, Shamor, right? Sometimes we say those refer to the positive and negative commandments of Shabbat. And then the Nevi'im add two, Kavod va'oneg. So if someone had said to me, Rabbanit Yael, is there a mitzvah to be happy on Yantif? I'm on Shabbos. I might have said, oh, Oneg Shabbat, right? Oneg Shabbat is eating good foods and wearing nice clothes, increasing our joy on Shabbat. But it's not actually Simcha, and it's not actually in the Torah, right? It's in the Nevi'im. But those are the four dimensions according to the Rambam. And then the question is, what about Yom Tov? So maybe we'll just actually, the mitzvah of Yom Tov comes from Devarim. V'samachta b'chagecha, right? You should rejoice, you should have simcha on your festival holidays. Ata u'bincha u'bitecha v'abdecha v'amatcha v'halevi v'hager v'hayatom v'halmana asher b'sharecha. All the people, right? Your children, your servants, the Levi, the stranger, the orphan, the widow, should all have this simcha on Yom Tov. Okay. So the Rambam says here, Kishem shemitzvah lechaber Shabbat ula'anga, right? Those are those Nevi'im words. Kach kol yamim tovim. So the Rambam starts by saying, just as we have these principles on Shabbat, we extend them to the Yom Tov, right? That we also have to honor and have oneg, to take delight, as it's translated here. Likdosh Hashem mechubad. V'chol yamim tovim ne'amar bahan mikra kodesh, right? Because all of the chagim are called kodesh, and Shabbat is kodesh, and so therefore the words of Shabbat must extend to Yom Tov. The ukvar be'arnu hakibud v'ha'inug b'hilchot Shabbat. So we've already explained what honor and delight, what oneg and kavod are in Hilchot Shabbos. V'chein ra'ui la'adam shelo yis'od b'arvei yamim tovim min hamincha u'lamala ke'erev Shabbat shedavar zeh bichlal hakavod. Now, this is an interesting one. I thought about taking it out, and I'll tell you why, because I get this complaint often on Erev Shavuos that the Rambam says, and then therefore the Shulchan Aruch says, that you should not eat a significant meal from Mincha time onward on Erev Yantif or Erev Shabbat, and I serve a meal on Erev Yantif at Shavuos time. I think that there are many ways to understand this, but from the Rambam's perspective, at this time in the world where food was however it was, coming into Yantif for Shabbat hungry was considered kavod, right? How could you take oneg Yantif or oneg Shabbos if you already felt full from whatever you were snacking on through the afternoon? Okay. וכל המבזה את המועדות כאילו נטפל לעבודת כוכבים. And anyone who treats holidays, the moadim, with kavod is considered as though they're worshiping idols. Right? So these mitzvot of kavod and oneg are intertwined, but simcha might be specifically for chag. If we just read the first page, I think we could walk away from this source sheet and say, so sorry, one second. So please sit, give me that. Go upstairs and read nicely, okay? I'm in the middle of teaching a class. That if we ended on page 1, we would think that there is Simcha on Yantif and Kavod and Oneg on Shabbat, and therefore also on Yantif, but it doesn't seem like the direction goes in the other direction. The directionality is one way here. However, enter our week's Parsha, Parshat Bamidbar, and in Perek Yud, it says, "V'yom simchatem u'v'moadechem u'vershay chadashechem u'teka'atem b'chatzatrot al alotechem v'al zivchei shlomechem v'hayu lechem lizikaron lifnei Hashem Elokechem ani Hashem Elokechem." On your joyous occasions. Now, those joyous occasions are described as our moadim, our fixed yantif. Sit down. I'm so sorry. My children are very awake at this time of night. And Will is unfortunately not here. Okay, Moadim, right? What are our Yom Simchatchem? That's the question. What are our days of happiness? Our Moadim, right? Those are our Chagim. Our Roshei Chodashim, that's the Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. And on those days, you should sound the shofarot, right? You should blow your shofarot over your offerings of Zivchei Shlamim and Alotechem. And that will be a reminder of Hashem. Okay, so the Ibn Ezra says, Uvayom Simchatchem, right? What are these days? He says, oh, well, part of these days of gladness are when you come back from the land of your enemies. Sheshavtem me'eretz oyev o nitzachtem ha'oyev haba alechem, or you defeat an enemy who attacks you. The kavatem yom simcha, and you establish a day of rejoicing. Kiyemei Purim ushivat yemei Chizkiah, right, which is Hanukkah. So it seems like perhaps the Ibn Ezra is trying to say Purim and Hanukkah, which are not traditionally Moadim, right? They're not Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, that they might become Yom Simcha in our communities. It's interesting to think, Rav Tabori writes in his article, right, writing from Israel, it's interesting to think what Yom HaAtzmaut or Yom Yerushalayim, how those might sort of fit into this rubric today. Purim and Hanukkah, right, certainly before the Ibn Ezra's time. And he says, however, our transmitters of tradition, our rabbis, right, explains that the day of gladness refers to Shabbat. The trumpets were sounded so that Bnei Israel would hear that the offerings were being offered, right? The korbanot were being offered, and they would yikavnu libam lashem, that they would direct their hearts to Hashem. So interestingly, it seems like the Ibn Ezra is maybe saying that Shabbat is like Yom Tov, right? That maybe there is some kind of obligation to have simcha on Shabbat because it falls into this pasuk of Yom Simchatchem. Rav Tabori explains the Sifrei better than the Sifrei does for us. And so I brought this little, I always like to bring a little piece of him anyway. I brought this little snippet where he explains that the Sifrei actually has two different, um, sorry, it's so loud in my house, it's very distracting. The Sifrei has two different manuscripts. And in our standard edition, the Sifrei presents a different explanation of the phrase days of Simcha, claiming that it refers to Shabbat, right? That's in line with the Ibn Ezra. So our Sifrei and the Ibn Ezra seem to be the same. However, the variant text of the Vilna Gaon, as cited in the Netziv's edition of the Sifrei, right? So all of these oral texts, when they were written down, had some variation between text to text. Different people had different manuscripts. So our manuscript seems in line with the Ibn Ezra. However, the Netziv's edition of the Sifrei says that the day, rather than the complete phrase days of Simcha, refers to Shabbat. So the Yom might be Shabbat, but Simchatchem is just the Moadim and Rosh Chodesh. And so, quite possibly, these two versions differ on the question of whether there's an obligation of Simcha and Shabbat, right? Depending if you have the Netziv's version, it seems like maybe you don't have an obligation of Simcha and Shabbat. If you have the version we have of the standard, maybe the Sifrei agrees with the Ibn Ezra. Right? So this question is not, can you be happy on Shabbat? Of course, that's a wonderful thing. But is there some kind of obligation, the same way we might talk about that question on Sukkot or Shavuos or Pesach, is a different story. So what Rav Tabori does, and we'll look at a little bit of what he does, is he tries to find places where Shabbat is treated the same as Yom Tov or where it's separated out to try and see, right, are these the same or are they different? And then we'll end by looking at a story from the Gemara together. Right, so here there is a question in the Gemara Yerushalmi about when you have Purim on Shabbat, what would happen? That doesn't make sense. You can't have Purim on Shabbat. Hold on, let me just confer with my notes for 1 second. But I think the question, I don't know if you can see this that I'm looking at now. Oh, so actually, I don't think that we allow Purim to fall on Shabbat anymore. But if Purim, the Gemara Yerushalmi, it is about if Purim falls on Shabbat, then there's a question as to whether or not you should have a Purim Suda. Right? Should your Suda be on Friday or on Sunday instead of on Shabbat? And it explains that the Megillah instructs us to make Purim a day of Simcha, right? Oops, let's go back to where we were. Okay, right, so if Amar Leila Sot Otam Yemei Mishteh V'Simcha, Et Shsimcha Tov Taluya B'Veitin, Yatsa Zes Shsimchato Taluya B'Yedei Hashamayim, right? If Shabbat already has Simcha, then maybe we don't need this special Purim Suda to make Purim Simchadik. If Shabbat didn't have an obligation of Simcha, then maybe we would have needed to have the Purim Suda. So it seems like the Yerushalmi is saying that Shabbat carries some degree of Simcha that is external to Purim and means we don't have to work quite as hard to be happy on Purim as we would if it was on a regular weekday. So again, they're not commenting directly on our pasuk the way the Sifrei and the Ibn Ezra were, but it seems as though the Yerushalmi is sort of weighing in on this question. What counts as Yimei Simcha? This is a Tosfot. They have recently, Sefaria gets more and more amazing day by day. This is the new way that Sefaria puts together their Tosfot in English. I think it's beautiful. They give us an overview that the Gemara that we're talking about is about Sheva Brachot. And the question is about panim chadashot, right? Typically, we say at Sheva Brachot, you need to have new faces. The idea is that the new faces will bring the chatan and kala even more joy, even more simcha. And so if you don't have panim chadashot, you can't have a Sheva Brachot. And the question is here, I mean, this is not the question of the Tosfot sort of in general, but the question that's relevant to us is whether or not you need panim chadashot on Shabbat. Right? If on Shabbat you do nim panim chadashot, we might think Shabbat is not inherently filled with simcha. We don't have an obligation for simcha anyway. If you don't need panim chadashot on Shabbat, then we might say Shabbat has a lot of simcha, right? And we see here that the Tosfot says that you do not need panim chadashot on Shabbat, right? V'Shabbat dechashivanan panim chadashot. Shabbat counts as our panim chadashot. We're going to skip the proof text here for a second and say, so the Tosfot explains, Hatam namim marbin lichvod haShabbat b'simcha v'suzat Shabbat, that we add and joy in the festive meal in honor of Shabbat. So the panim chadashot give us additional simcha, but Shabbat also gives us additional simcha. And so perhaps, again, it seems like consistently we're seeing that Shabbat has its own inherent simcha. Here is just one case in the other direction. Sorry, two cases in the other direction. The first, on the opposite end of the spectrum, perhaps, from Sheva Brachot, is Shiva. Right? The question is, what could cancel a Shiva? What like force is strong enough to cancel Shiva? Yantif is one of those forces. If chas v'shalom you lose a person in the days preceding a Yom Tov, Pesach, Shavuot, or Sukkot, and you have not completed a full Shiva or Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, those days cut Shiva off. So if you've only sat 3 days of Shiva or 2 days or whatever, then that's it. You don't sit any more Shiva after the Yantif is over. But Shabbat does not cancel Shiva. Now, of course, some of the rabbis are like, well, obviously, you would never sit a full Shiva if Shabbat canceled Shiva. So maybe practically, we just don't allow Shabbat to cancel Shiva. But it does seem like maybe Shabbat has a little bit less simcha than Yom Tov. That somehow we can align ourselves with sitting Shiva on Shabbat in a way that we can't align. We can't understand how you could sit Shiva on a day that you must have simcha on. Does that make sense? So it's kind of the opposite perspective, right? Maybe Shabbat satisfies the simcha of Purim or Sheva Brachot, but it seems to not be strong enough to interrupt Shiva. And similarly, the Shulchan Aruch says that the Bigdei Yom Tov have to be yoter tovim mishel Shabbat. That somehow, if we think our clothes help give us that simcha to Yom Tov, we don't need such a strong simcha on Shabbos. So this is not conclusive one way or the other, but we've lined up two sources on the one hand that say Shabbos doesn't seem to have the same level of simcha as Yom Tov, and two that say maybe it does. Interestingly, two sort of middle ground approaches. One is that in the Lecha Dodi, you can see, right, Boi b'shalom ateret ba'ala, right, whatever tune you want to apply here, gam besimcha uvetzahala, right? That's how we read it. Come in peace, the ateret ba'ala, whatever that is, in simcha and in tzahala, in joy and in jubilation. And Rav Tabori records a really interesting practice of the Arizal. So the Ari had the practice of reciting, the Ari would sing Gam Besimcha on Yom Tov, but would substitute the word Rina in the place of Simcha when it was just Shabbat. So most of the year, the Ari sang a different variation of Lecha Dodi than we have. He would sing Gam Berina Uvitzahala. And on those few days, we just had one on Shavuos when Yom Tov, and it's just gonna have to wait a minute, love, okay? That on Yom Tov and Shabbat, he would sing Basimcha, right? So the Ari would say, we can't apply the word Simcha to Astam Shabbat. We only apply it to a day that also is Yom Tov. Right. Thank you, Rabbi Eliakim. If you have a Sidur that is Nusach Sfard, then that's what will be printed in your Sidur. In our Sidur, obviously, the word Rina does not appear, and we sing about Simcha every Shabbat. You know, I think we could say that this is not a halachic Simcha, but like sort of colloquial Simcha. Or we could say maybe you need Simcha on Shabbat, but the Ari certainly didn't seem so. And he also, then Rav Tabori goes on to say, on the other hand, the Ari had the practice of reciting Yismechu during all of the Shabbat tefillot, as opposed to the custom of Nusach Ashkenaz to recite it only at Musaf, right? So we only say the Yismechu at Musaf. The Ari said it all of Shabbat long, including this paragraph in every prayer would imply that Simcha does apply to Shabbat. Whereas limiting it to Musaf would suggest that there is no law of Simcha per se on Shabbat, which means that the Ari is like kind of trying to split the baby, right? He doesn't want to sing about Simcha and Lecha Dodi, but he says Yismachu throughout all of his tefillot. And we are happy and comfortable singing about Simcha, but we don't say Yismachu for all of our tefillot. I think Rav Soloveitchik has a really nice explanation as recorded in Rav Tabari, that the verse in our Parsha cited by the Sifrei, right? So he is citing our standard tradition as the source of obligation of Simcha on Shabbat refers only to the actual time when they brought the sacrifice, the Musaf offering. This is an obligation of song and Simcha when the sacrifice was brought, and therefore the Ashkenazic custom is to recite Yismachu only at Musaf. Right? I think this is like that elegant solution that the rabbis can always fall back on. Oh, that only happens during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, right? Today, right, Rahman al poor us, we don't have a Beit HaMikdash. We can't experience true Simcha on Shabbos. But in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, when we offer a Korban Musaf, then we automatically feel that, right? Just like when we offer a Korban Musaf on Rosh Chodesh or on Yantif. And so that is like a interesting way to explain the variance, maybe is the way I would say it. So there is no steady conclusion in Rav Tabori's article, and therefore none in our source sheet, which is to say that Simcha is nice. It doesn't seem conclusive that one must have Simcha on Shabbat. Although there certainly is a tradition upon which to stand to say that one should have Simcha on Shabbat. I thought this was an interesting question, but I just wanted to end with a famous story, which is to explore a little bit, to think a little bit about the nuance, um, to think about the nuance of what Oneg Shabbat is, right? So we saw that the pasuk from, sorry if I'm giving anyone whiplash here, that the pasuk, where is it? Here we go, from Yeshayahu, is talks about the Oneg Shabbat, the Karata la Shabbat Oneg, right? And that Oneg Shabbat is maybe more about like the things that we surround ourselves with. It's not about a feeling of true simcha, it's about enjoyment. And that's where we, add all kinds of delicious things and to our tables and have nice meals and wear nice clothes. Whereas on Yantif, we should have a nice meal for Yantif, but that Simcha is sort of like internal to oneself, not about what they're enjoying at their table. And so this story popped into my mind. I tracked it down. It's the story of Yosef Mokar Shabbat, Yosef Mokir Shabbat, the story of a man named Yosef who cherishes Shabbat. And the story goes like this. Ahava hahu goy b'shivavute dahava nefishe nichse tuva. There was a story about a non-Jewish person in the neighborhood, in Yosef's neighborhood, whose property was very good, was very plentiful. They were a wealthy non-Jewish person. Amrele Kaldai, the astrologer, said to this man, Kulhu nichse, Yosef mokar shabe achel lahu. Yosef, who cherishes Shabbat, will eat all of your property, consume it. That was a troubling story for this non-Jewish gentleman. And so Azal Zavninhu Lechulhu Nichse, Zvan Bahu Marganita, Otva Besayane. Right? This is an old story, a heavily Aramaic story. So the non-Jewish man went and he sold all of his property. He consolidated all of his wealth into a very big pearl, and he placed it into his hat, right? So he's threatened that Yosef Mokar Shabbos is going to eat his fortune. And so he says, well, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to consolidate my fortune into my pearl in my hat and run away. Bahade daka avar mabara, sort of interesting echo of Yonah here, right? That someone gets sort of like a prophecy. This is from astrologers, not from Hashem, runs away onto a boat. And when he is on the boat, where did I go here? Afriche zika, sedaye bamaya, bale kavara. That when he's crossing the river in the ferry, the wind blew his hat and cast it into the water, and a fish swallowed it. Askua aitu apane demale shabta. Um, the fish was caught and removed from the water, and it was brought to the shore at nightfall. So the man doesn't get swallowed by a fish, but his entire fortune, which had been consolidated into the pearl, does get swallowed by the fish. The fish gets caught by a fisherman, and they bring it in on Erev Shabbos, like Friday afternoon. Amri, the sailors say to each other, the fishermen, Man zaven kihashta, who will buy this fish right now? Who buys fish at this time? Maybe everyone else has bought their fish already. Amri lahu zilu amtihu legabe Yosef mokar shabe de regil zaven. And they say, oh, Yosef, who loves the Shabbat, regularly buys delicious delicacies, really fancy splurges at this time of day because he loves Shabbat. Right? He loves oneg Shabbat. Eating this fish, I might argue, based on this shiur, makes him happy, right? He wants to feel Simcha on Shabbat. And so he gets this fish. And so that's what the fishermen say. Okay. Antihu nihale zavne. They brought it to him, and he purchases it. Kare ashkach be marganita. And he opens the fish to prepare it for Shabbat, and he finds the pearl inside. Paga behahu saba amar mandiyaze shabata pare shabata. And he was sold it for 13 vessels filled with gold. This elderly man who encountered him, the moral of the story is going to be delivered by this elderly man, one who lends to Shabbat, Shabbat repays him. So this has been made into a fantastic children's story, which my children love. So I picture this Yosef Mokar Shabbat as the way that the author or the narrator, the illustrator did, right? But this idea, I think, that Shabbat repays you, that if you bring all of your oneg to Shabbat, you get oneg Shabbat. If you bring Simcha to Shabbat, you'll get Simcha on Shabbat, whether it's an obligation or not, right? So I think, although I think the question is interesting, I think maybe I feel like the answer is less interesting of Rav Tabori's question, which is to say, okay, whether it's a mitzvah or not, we have the opportunity to create Simcha through our oneg Shabbos, which is clearly much more straightforwardly a part of the mitzvah of Shabbos. And so, we can all be Yosef Makar Shabbat. Shabbat can be dear to us all. And when it is, when we cherish the Shabbat cherishes us, right? Shabbat repays us with whatever energy we bring it. So that is not an answer to the question of whether it's a mitzvah, but I think often in the summer months, there is like a draggy feeling to Shabbat. It's so long, it goes on, so late into the night, at least in Michigan, I think Shabbat ends at 10:05 this week or something. But that this idea that we can re-infuse our Shabbat with oneg and with simcha, with singing on Erev Shabbat, or with nice davening, with a nice meal with friends or with family, right? That whatever we bring into Shabbat, Shabbat will repay to us. And I wish that we will all have really beautiful simcha, oneg-filled Shabbats. But I'm going to stop sharing and welcome thoughts, questions. Yeah, Bobby.
It was always, I always heard from more religious people that it was a custom to buy new clothing for Pesach and for Rosh Hashanah. And so
it's that convenient because it's the time where the weather changes.
So I mean, from the literature you brought up, the clothing you wear on Yom Tov has to be more special than what you wear on Shabbat.
Yes.
So people had a custom of going out and getting something new and special for those two holidays.
Yeah.
I never did because we couldn't afford it, but
Yeah.
and it just wasn't, my thing to do. But it's a custom that people have. For the holidays, you get something special.
Hmm.
Those two holidays, you get something special.
Yeah. And I think that right, that definitely plays into, stems from the Shulchan Aruch's interpretation, because otherwise you might get it for the Shabbat before the Yontif, if the Shabbat sort of took precedence, right? Yeah, it's a great point. Were you going to say something, Jerry? Oh, I thought you had raised your hands. I think that the question of how we could be commanded to feel simcha, right? And like what that means is like a much broader question for Yontif especially. But the idea that it could also apply to Shabbat, that like we have to sort of place ourselves in that um, mindset every Shabbat could both be sort of taxing and also really beautiful. Like sometimes it's hard to head into Shabbat. It's been a long week or you're stressed out about something. And this idea that like it's not just nice to feel happy, but like it's a mitzvah could be sort of liberating. Like you have to do it, so you just do it. Or it could be exhausting, right? Like week after week. It's one thing to save that for 3 times a year. It's another to have to do it every week.
It's also a different experience of Shabbat in Jerusalem
Hmm.
than you have anywhere else, or that you have here in the States. Because the stores start closing and all of the flower sellers are out on the corners,
Mm-hmm.
and people are rushing, and it's just a whole different feeling. And
Mm-hmm.
then in Jerusalem, this isn't everywhere, but in Jerusalem or parts of Jerusalem, everything closes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so you know that this is not a regular day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I always felt that like that lent like this air of like kedusha, right, of holiness to the day. Like it got this sort of quiet and hush. Um, but the simcha, like the flowers, is a nice example, right, of like bringing something to your table that causes you simcha. Could be found on every street corner. That's pretty cool.
I I'm when it comes to creating simcha, in other words, you make it yourself, whether it's simcha or other kinds of joyful experience. I think of the way people use music to
Mm-hmm.
make the day special, largely because our introduction to elaborate Shabbat observance was with a Mizrahi family in West Rogers Park who
Hmm.
invited us to stay over with them for a 3 day yontif. I think it was Pesach, which Shabbat and the two Seders. It was really trial by fire. But it was fascinating how both the holiday and Shabbat were elaborated in a tremendous variety of ways. Of course, food, the guests coming and going, but singing at the table, which began even before the food was served. I mean, while we were waiting for
Hmm.
the first, after the challah and so on, with the salads to come out, there were songs and special songs about the Shabbat coming in, and then
Hmm.
several of the popular poems that are sung on Friday night have to do with the food and the fish and
Hmm.
all the
That's
good
right.
things we
Basar V'Dagim.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a matter of, oh, well, I know another tune. So then we have all the Yemenite tunes and the Ashkenazi tunes. And I just love that. I just love that because it really makes the day different.
Yeah.
And talking about long summer evenings, this and also our first visit to Jerusalem in 1985 to Israel. We spent Shabbat with some colleagues with young children in Rehovot. They
Mm-hmm.
lived near a Yemenite neighborhood just blocks away. And aside from the siren that went off 20 minutes before, sunset,
Hmm.
um, we could hear chanting coming from the Yemenite shul.
Hmm.
And we could experience a Yemenite challah that our hostess had acquired for the occasion. Whew,
Hmm.
it was beautiful. And that feeling of peace that came over everything because after the sirens sounded, the streets
Hmm.
were quiet. Nobody was
Yeah,
driving.
a feeling of peace, right? That's like a
Yeah.
kedusha of peace. These are like, are they, right? They're certainly at odds with the way we think of Simcha as sort of like frivolous joy in like modern Hebrew. But if we think of Simcha as like a deeper spiritual feeling, maybe these are complementary, right? I'm not trying to say they're different, but I think you're teasing out interesting characteristics of Shabbat.
But
Yeah.
just
I'm not
just
sure. There's this very beautiful song in which Shabbat is with wonderful imagery about Shabbat that's called Malka, Shabbat HaMalka.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with the sun is setting and the Shabbat is descending from the
yeah.
heavens, accompanied by uh, a host of malachim, of angels. Are you familiar
Mm.
with that song?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I actually first learned it in
החמה מראש האילנות נסתלקה, בואו ונצא לקראת שבת המלכה, הנה
Hmm.
היא יורדת, הקדושה הברוכה, ועימה מלאכים צבא שלום ומנוחה.
That's
בואי
beautiful.
בואי המלכה, בואי בואי הכלה. Yeah.
the sun on the treetops no longer is seen. Come
Wow.
welcome to welcome the Shabbos, our queen.
Yes.
I think music is a great example of something that feels like it's appealing to the simcha of Shabbat over the oneg, right? It's like a little bit hard to separate out, is the food oneg Shabbat or simcha Shabbat? But music, I think, is definitely goes to that feeling of simcha on Shabbat. Yeah, beautiful. Thanks for sharing that song.
I'm also reminded of a movie which wasn't a very good one in terms of the plot, but the imagery of what it's like in a Hasidic household on Shabbat was just mind blowing. It really has stuck in my imagination.
Hmm.
The story is about a murder in this community and
Hmm.
the detective who's brought in to investigate by planting her in the rabbi's house, and she's living among them for a number of weeks. And it's a woman, of course, which complicates matters, and the plot hinges on that. But she's from an Irish family, and she's totally out of it. And little by little, they're, introducing her because she arrives there and gets settled in on Friday. So first
Mm.
of all, the kitchen is buzzing, all these people, they're baking bread, they're doing this and the other thing. And then as the evening proceeds, um, after dinner, they're singing and people are dancing. And you wind up with this wonderful scene of all the people around the table. She's got children in her lap, and it's just such a joyous
Mm.
depiction. Most of it wordless. You're just hearing the music and watching all of this activity.
Mm.
In the end, she winds up adopting some of their attitudes.
Amazing. Yeah, I think I always thought of I think of this as a very frum thing, but people who buy those bags of popcorn, those like big like grocery bags of popcorn in the store, it's like more common in Israel than in America. But in some kosher stores in America, you can also get this. And my son is interested. He's sitting up on the couch. And I always thought that this was like to increase the simcha of children on Shabbat. It's not the same as like candy or whatever. But I think it's like this novelty, this like fun, gigantic bag of popcorn shows up in your house every Friday afternoon. Um, and so I think there are lots of really beautiful ways that simcha shows up in Israel and in America. But it's interesting to think about if we would treat it differently if it was a mitzvah. I don't know if we would, right? I think it's hard to act upon that mitzvah, and we struggle with it on Yom Tov, so maybe it would just be a a struggle, or maybe it would become more a part of our practice. I don't know. On that very definitive note, um, I wish everyone a wonderful week. And I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 7 o'clock, no matter what the email says, 7 p.m., to look at next week's Parsha. And until then, I wish you an early Shabbat Shalom.
Yeah. Have a good week.
Right.
Thank you.